Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I'm your host, Jaime, CMO at World Football Summit. Today, we welcome Ben Peppi to the show. Ben currently is head of sport at JMW Solicitors, one of the top law firms in the UK, but he has knowledge across so many spaces: athletes, investment, consumer brands, and startups, just to name a few. Which is why I was very much looking forward to this conversation. Overall, it is about legacy, specifically about the pillars that build up an athlete's legacy after retirement. We start by talking about Leo Messi's new tech investment vehicle and why there's so much difference between American and European players when it comes to investing. And then we shift into different ways in which footballers are approaching their investment strategies. We then talk about sponsorship and how the player empowerment era is driving new partnership dynamics across the entire industry as players are becoming more values driven, and how all of this impacts the revenue models for football properties. We even get to talk about opportunities in Web3 and the social impact initiatives that many football players are putting in place. For me, this was a true masterclass, and I hope you enjoy it too. But a quick disclaimer: this conversation is not and should not be taken as financial advice. It is provided for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Finally, remember, World Football Summit Africa is right around the corner. On November 16th and 17th, Durban will become the capital of the global industry. You can't miss it. Head over to our website, africa.worldfootballsummit.com, and buy your ticket. Again, that is africa.worldfootballsummit.com. And with that, on to our conversation with Ben Peppi. Ben, welcome to the World Football Summit podcast. Honestly, I feel it's a great opportunity to have you here, especially with everything that's going on now in the world of sports in general and all the legal aspects that clubs and athletes need to consider. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Especially, we're going to focus on how the athlete landscape is changing and how they're looking to leave a legacy across many different fronts. But before going into the details of the conversation, I would like to ask you if you could introduce yourself to the audience briefly and maybe perhaps add why or how did you end up where you are today.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be a guest on the podcast. I've had the fortune of working in the sports industry for coming up to 10 years now, ever since I left university. So it's an industry that I'm obviously hugely passionate about, and one I've had the fortune to work in for a decent length of time now. And my role has evolved really over the course of the last 9.5, 10 years. I started life as a football agent. So I worked for a global football agency called Base Soccer, who recently got acquired by CAA, so rebranded as CAA Base. So that was the first 5 years of my career. And then came out of the agency industry in terms of talent representation and moved across to what was known as Lagardère Sports and Entertainment back then, but again, another rebrand. So they're now back to Sport 5, world's leading sports marketing group and rights holder. And I sat across their global partnerships portfolio. So I had the pleasure of working with brands nationally and internationally, connecting them with clubs, rights holders, events, governing bodies, talent, and was a really nice entry actually out of football, even though we still operated within football, into other sports as well. So we were working in properties like rugby, cricket, tennis, F1, golf, and then funnily enough, next week will be 5 years at JMW. Work really anniversary nice. Coming up. And my role and we'll obviously talk about it in due course, but my role here is kind of two things really. One, I co-lead our sports team. We're a full service national law firm. And where that feeds nicely into our sports practice is that means we can act for talent, we can act for clubs, governing bodies, but also more recently sports technology businesses, brands, investors looking in the startup ecosystem. So the JMW piece is one side, and then one of the main cruxes to what I do is I lead and manage a business within JMW, which is a platform called Barndoor, which connects athletes alongside traditional investors to new business and active commercial opportunities, with the idea that we're going to help athletes prepare for life beyond sport by connecting them into opportunities that will resonate and be relevant for them. And we do that in 4 ways, basically: investment opportunities, brand ambassador commercial opportunities, IP equity opportunities, which we'll certainly touch on today, and strategic advisory as well. So that's a kind of a potted history on my background.
Well, that's impressive background. And also, hey, congratulations on your 5-year work anniversary, at JMW. So, hey, that's something to celebrate. And really why I wanted to have you as a guest on the podcast is because I think this topic of I like to call it as the legacy that athletes leave behind is top of the spear right now. You see a lot of athletes working on building that legacy, and today I want to focus on what I would say 3 fronts. One is investment, the other one would be sponsorship, and the final one would be, call it, social commitments, because I think that's also part of the legacy that athletes can leave behind if they wish to, because of the influence that they have. But I think we can start things off with, I think the most recent news, or not, maybe not the most recent, but definitely one of the most popular, which is Messi, Leo Messi. He just opened up his investment vehicle to invest in tech-related startups. This is an interesting dynamic because you see a lot of footballers doing this, but I don't know if you can give a sense of, or give the audience a sense of the landscape right now, or a general overview of what's going on in that space.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly big news, and definitely is recent, right? It was only a couple of weeks ago that Messi announced his investment vehicle, and as you touched upon earlier, it's certainly an increasing trend. So in terms of the landscape, I mean, athletes getting involved with businesses and brands is nothing new. It dates back to the days of when IMG first started, and Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer and Gary Player, their kind of intellectual property rights being commercialized, and athletes getting involved in all sorts of different business and brand opportunities. But I suppose where things have changed slightly is that the modern athlete and the modern footballer is becoming, I'd say, increasingly savvy to the vast array of opportunities that exist beyond that traditional business or brand portfolio, right? And they are looking across the pond, and they're looking at US athletes starting their own venture funds or getting involved with startups, and realizing that beyond their kind of traditional portfolio, i.e. their kind of commercial deals with sportswear providers and a few other kind of traditional brand endorsements, there's a plethora of opportunities out there within early stage venture and within the technology ecosystem, where not only could they invest into opportunities, but add significant value to those businesses because of who they are. So this whole trend of athletes now wanting to get involved in opportunities where they can actually be genuinely a part of that business growth from a brand profile perspective, from a network perspective, an industry expertise perspective, has meant that they've started to lean towards getting involved in early stage businesses that are more exciting for them, more glamorous, and they look at the Michael Jordan blueprint and they go, I want to be like that guy.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned several things that I think we can follow up. We can touch upon a little bit later. But I think the first thing is, you mentioned that Messi follows the footsteps of many American athletes. So yeah, that was one of the questions I had with that, because I also perceive that as well. You see the greats in the United States. You see your LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Patrick Mahomes, or Tom Brady. To touch upon other sports. So why is that? Why is it that American athletes seem to be, I wouldn't say one, but definitely a couple of steps ahead in this regard?
Sure. It's a very good point and a very kind of valid and factual point. I think it's a few reasons. I think firstly, what we have to look at is the wider ecosystem, and the reality is that the startup venture ecosystem in itself, outside of sport, is more advanced in the US than it is in the UK and Europe. So I think the kind of the general industry trend of what the early stage landscape looks like is definitely a factor. If we're looking at athletes specifically, I think education plays a big part. We know that a lot of US athletes go to college, they get scholarships, and then they come out of college and go into professional sport. The reality is that in the UK and Europe, that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Leo Messi was dominating the Champions League as a teenager, right?
Exactly.
He wasn't in college playing in varsity games and so on and so forth. And having represented and looked after academy footballers, I know the education programs they were going through, and I know how much time they spent at school, and I can guarantee you that it certainly wasn't the same amount of time that US athletes were. So I think education is definitely one. I think industry network is another. So what we're finding with those US athletes that you mentioned before is that they not only have a very significant network outside of the sports industry with C-suite level execs, business owners, not just of their kind of blue chip brand partners, but also the kind of wider network of through their friends, through their business contacts,
Mm-hmm.
and that willingness to open out that network book and contact book exposes them to more opportunity. Athletes in the UK and Europe, in our experience, and footballers specifically, have a very tight-knit team around them. So they're probably not as exposed to as much opportunity, which then leads to, I suppose, less of an appetite to venture into new opportunities. And I think finally, the US is a very athlete-led endorsement economy, right? So if you look at consumer-facing businesses, in the US, you go to Times Square or you go wherever else, and you see athletes on billboards everywhere, and you see US athletes, US musicians, actors, actresses endorsing brands all the time. That would be my kind of top line breakdown of both the wider ecosystem, but also the specific reasons why I think it's more advanced in the US than the UK. But importantly, I think the landscape is changing for the better, and the news of Messi, as you said, is hopefully going to have a domino effect with kind of European footballers and UK footballers for sure.
I think so too. And you mentioned a couple of interesting points there. Education piece, definitely. Curious to see now that you have a lot of interest in leagues where they're actually players are coming out of high school in the United States, going directly into these professional leagues that are only for, let's say, these younger players. See what that happens with that in the future. Then you also mentioned the ecosystem, which plays a huge role. So, for example, when you think about Kevin Durant, I think one of the main reasons why he decided to leave Oklahoma to go to Golden State is there was going to be an easier connection to all the Silicon Valley startups. So for him, it was going to be, a great opportunity there. No, I guess the question that I have now is: we are talking about the greats in every sport: Leo Messi, Kevin Durant, LeBron James. Is this something that's only open to the big names, or is any athlete able to access these opportunities?
I think it's an interesting point, and I think an interesting question. I think it depends on the sport, right? So you've got team sports and you've got individual sports, and the reality is that in sports like tennis and golf, that are very much individual sports, or even F1, there are only a few greats in those industries and in those sports that could leverage their profile to the extent of being able to add value potentially beyond capital resource or industry expertise, right? So I think the question really needs to be split between two things. From a financial perspective, can a lot of athletes start getting involved in startups? The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that Premier League footballers earn a significant amount of money, and if they choose to allocate 10% of their investment portfolio to early stage businesses, that could lead to a fairly sizable portfolio of startup investments, especially with kind of the tax breaks you get in the UK with EIS relief and so on. But I'm a big believer in that the value the athletes drive goes far beyond their capital resource, and that comes from the brand awareness piece. It comes from their industry expertise. So if you look at an example of a top 20 ATP Tour tennis player, the reality is that they'll have enough capital to invest, so can certainly start to build up an investment portfolio that could then go on to be supremely successful. They have a contact book and network, so they can certainly leverage that for the benefit of an early stage business. But do they have the brand profile to be attractive enough for a consumer startup to say, hey, I'm willing to give you a percentage of equity within my business for you to promote me on social media or event appearances and so on and so forth? And that's where it becomes trickier. But I certainly think this is a market that's open to a huge amount of athletes. We work with a number of Olympians who don't have any capital to invest into businesses, but have got huge brand profile. And we've done equity deals for them where they're adding enormous value to startups beyond simply just being able to write a check. So the answer is I don't think it should be prohibitive. I think things will need to change on both sides. I think athletes need to become more aware of the opportunities that are out there and educate themselves on how they're going to add value. And I think that the businesses need to become more aware of the value athletes drive beyond just what they initially assume to be, oh, they can endorse my business and that's going to lead to a ton of sales and a ton of incremental enterprise value.
Mm-hmm. And you touched upon this briefly before, but are there any specific categories where these athletes are investing? As I know, every case differs, right? But I don't know if there's a broad scope of categories where they invest. And I guess more importantly, why is it that they choose those categories?
Sure. So I think it tends to skew more to kind of consumer-facing businesses, so either direct-to-consumer or B2B2C businesses, which is business-to-business kind of businesses that then provide a product or service to a consumer. I think generally it's businesses that they can almost kind of touch, smell, feel that resonate and are relevant for them. So as great as a B2B SaaS business may be, and as good as that might be from an investment perspective, the reality is that to a lot of athletes, if they were to receive that kind of deck or IM, that business isn't necessarily going to resonate with them straight away and be relevant. And they might not be able to add much value beyond simply writing an angel check or a VC check as part of their fund. So I think the skew is definitely more consumer than not. I think in terms of kind of industries, obviously sports tech, health tech is an obvious one, wellness, consumer lifestyle. Mm-hmm. You're obviously seeing a big trend of athletes getting involved in esports, new digital media. So our athletes are leveraging their significant profile on new media platforms. So I certainly think it tends to skew more towards kind of those businesses that have a resonance and relevance for them, which then leads on to the next phase of that, which is those businesses that are potentially purpose-driven, that align to their personal values, not just their kind of values as a sports person. And that's different things for every athlete, as you rightly mentioned. So you might have an athlete that wants to help increase financial literacy in Africa, as an example, and leave their legacy in that way. Yeah, I think in terms of general trend, kind of direct to consumer, tech-enabled businesses in sectors that resonate, that also align with kind of personal values as well as just kind of athlete values as such.
Yeah. And I realized something that you mentioned there. No, a lot of footballers are investing in esports, which in a way, and please correct me if you don't see this as I interpret it, but in a way, it could be counterintuitive for a footballer to invest in esports, because at the end of the day, it's not that they're competing leagues, but almost, because they're both, let's say, looking for the fans' attention. Do you see it like that, or is it just because they know the space well and it's something they're interested in that they invest in it?
Yeah, I don't see it as competing in the sense of, I think the market is a very different market. So I think the bigger worry would actually be for the sports clubs and rights holders, that their fans and their audience is being taken away from their own sports teams through the medium of new esports teams, right? Which is why a lot of them have created their own esports
Yeah.
teams. So Mesut Ozil is obviously a prime example of an athlete who is very vocal and publicly, the public are kind of aware of the, I suppose, the passion he has for that sector and that industry. I think the reality is that athletes have a large social reach. So having an esports team allows them to be kind of hands-on in the business as content creators, which obviously then in turn leads to significant revenue if they are part owners in a team, right? So whether it's on Twitch or it's on YouTube or whatever it might be, they all are fully aware that esports has exploded over the last few years. It's an industry in itself. It's not, oh, it's a part of football or another kind of sporting industry. It is an industry in itself, right? It has broadcast, it has events, it has teams, it has leagues, etc., etc. So a lot of these players who are becoming esports owners, as I mentioned and touched upon before, they sit at the intersection of millennials, Gen Z, and this is the chance for them to be a part of the next iteration of kind of what sport and the intersection with technology might involve, right? The reality is that owning a football club is prohibitive. Footballers do not own football clubs, I suppose, in the traditional sense. I know that it's starting to change with David Beckham and obviously the example recently with Cesc Fabregas and SC Como. But the footballers don't have billions of pounds to go and invest into a Premier League football club, right? Whereas owning an esports club at the moment isn't prohibitive for them because they can become part owners and the entry point is accessible. It's an industry they get. So it really just mirrors all the reasons why they would invest into another startup. And to kind of circle back to your initial point around whether I see it as competitive or not, I think it's a smart decision from them, and I think if they get it right, it could lead to significant, obviously, capital return, but also benefits in a number of other areas too.
Thank you for that, because I mean, it was one of the doubts that I had, and in the process, you actually answered another doubt that I had, which is how do you see this trend where you see it more in the US, where athletes are investing in clubs. You do see it here with the example of Cesc Fabregas and Como. Just to finish this section off, though, I do want to ask. I don't know, and I don't know how much of a public information is this, and if we either you can answer that or you don't know. But is there any footballer that's doing a good job, or it can be an example of someone who's investing well into any type of space?
Yeah, I think there's numerous examples, right? I think the difference in football, I suppose, is that the opportunities they're investing in are quite siloed. So there's no like vehicle where you can kind of look at a venture fund's portfolio and go, they've invested into 35 different businesses across these sectors and you can see the success, right? Because a lot of them, the reality is that it's pure angel investments at the moment. I always think Kieran Gibbs is a very good example. Okay. So he's a venture partner with Build Ventures, which is a $15 million fund that backs fintechs in Africa, as an example, and also a limited partner in a venture company called Class 5 Global. You very rightly used the example of Kevin Durant moving club, or franchise rather, to get closer to Silicon Valley, right? Kieran Gibbs has moved to Inter Miami, and I've got no doubt that part of the reason for being there was to expose himself further to the startup ecosystem, and has since come out and publicly said that being there has opened his eyes to the kind of the startup ecosystem in Miami in the US. He takes part of his salary in Bitcoin. And again, he was a big advocate for Bitcoin before he moved out to the US, but being there has only continued and cemented in his head what value digital currency will kind of hold in the future. So I think he's a really interesting example of someone who's touching on all the areas that we've discussed. He's part of a fund that's backing fintechs in Africa. He's moved out to the US to be part of the kind of not just the football, but also the venture ecosystem. Also part of a football player-owned club in Inter Miami as well. So yeah, I think he's kind of an interesting example and not one that would necessarily kind of spring to mind for a lot of people straight away.
I love those examples that are kind of under the radar. I think those are the ones that actually industry can learn more from. And I do want to touch very briefly because we're not going to have time to cover, if not all the questions, but you mentioned crypto and you mentioned, I guess that goes into our Web3 space, no? There's also a lot of trends now where athletes are investing in Web3 initiatives, call it NFTs, call it tokens, call it crypto, being paid in crypto. How do you see that landscape or that trend? Is because now the market seems to be kind of, wobbly. Do you think that's something that's going to keep happening, where athletes are actually investing in Web3 initiatives, or do you think they're going to hold off till the market situation clears up a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very topical, and we could probably talk for hours about what's possible, what's not possible, where the regulation may go. But the reality is that we're in the very first stage of the development, right? And the law is very much kind of still catching up. The reality is that there's a lack of legislation, and whilst there's a number of proposals out there for what Web3 and digital assets kind of may mean, we're still living in the unknown, right? And that's just the reality. So I think football, sport in general, footballers, athletes in general, kind of are all looking to dip their toe in the water now, because in 3 or 5 years, what seems impossible now will probably be possible. And the market will evolve as kind of new regulation comes out, but also as new opportunities and new initiatives come out. I think in terms of the NFT space specifically, I think there's things that are already working, that's for sure. So the idea of utility tokens and the idea of kind of tickets and rewards and money can't buy experiences being gifted and generated through the use of kind of tokens from clubs, from rights holders, ticketing companies, etc., is very much in full swing and is working. But with kind of an unregulated market comes enormous risk, enormous volatility. We know that Bitcoin, as an example, is down over 50% year to date. And interestingly, using kind of, I suppose, a sports example and a very high profile sports example of that, one of the big cases in the US at the moment is NBA Top Shots, right? So their Moments campaign, which created a whole load of very positive kind of PR and was huge. That's currently going through a legal case around whether those Top Shot moments should be classed with the NFT and the cards, so the digital basketball cards, should be classified as securities instead of trading cards or collectibles. So it's examples like that where I suppose NFT in sport, if they're suddenly classified as securities as opposed to kind of potentially trading cards or collectibles, is going to make a very big difference to people's business model, right? So one of the great European success stories within sports tech over the last few years is So Rare. And again, digital trading cards. So all of a sudden, if you have a precedent set around NBA Top Shot moments and whether they're kind of collectible cards are suddenly classed as securities, a new regulation comes in, you all of a sudden see kind of businesses changing the course of what they are or are unable to do. And that ultimately is Web3 in a nutshell. I think there's great examples. I think there's very bad examples. I think some of the athlete-led NFTs that we've seen over the course of the last 12 to 18 months have not been very good in reality. There's a whole ton of IP issues around the legislation, what players are and not able to do. But they've also learned, and I think that's the interesting thing. So what a lot of people are now realizing is that regardless of people's appetite for Web3 or appetite for the metaverse or appetite for NFTs, athletes, rights holders, clubs are realizing that you still need something tangible alongside it, right? So you're now starting to see a lot of NFTs come with actual real life experiences. So you might see an athlete kind of release an NFT, but there might be a money can't buy experience with that athlete alongside it. So you know that even if the value of that NFT goes up or down, and it goes down to zero, which invariably it could and has happened with quite a lot of them, you're still getting an in-person training session with a footballer, or getting a round of golf with a golfer, or a tennis masterclass with a tennis player. So the industry is continually learning. I think everyone is analyzing and assessing it. I think there is an enormous opportunity, and I think that opportunity is still in its infancy, but it's certainly not going away. And the reality is that Web3 and the metaverse is going to form a part of how we evolve. The idea that you turn up to sports events and you get rewarded through the use of non-fungible tokens and so on and so forth is great, because it means that clubs can start to learn more about their fans. And so continually evolving at a rapid pace. But it's still a case of kind of treading very carefully within the confines of what's possible legally, firstly. And the reality is that not a lot of people what is possible know what's possible legally, at the moment. And then continually evolving as new regulation comes out.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of interesting points there. I think first, athletes and clubs will need to define well what that concept of utility really means for the fan. Once they do, how do you scale that to generate mass adoption? So those are the first thought there. And then also something that you mentioned there brings me back to a panel that we had in Football Innovation Forum back in May, where Fred Antunes, he's the CEO at Real Fever, he was mentioning that from now on, commercial and legal teams will need to work very closely together to really understand what's possible and what's not, because as every day goes by, we learn something new. And what you were mentioning, before with Dapper Labs. Anyway, I want to shift now to another topic or another realm where athletes are actually looking to leave a legacy in sponsorship. I think the landscape has changed so much because now we live through what some experts call the player empowerment era, where big football players have even arguably a bigger brand than their football clubs. So you see the case of Kylian Mbappe or even Cristiano Ronaldo when he left Real Madrid for Juventus, the impact that it had in the social media. How do you see that landscape evolving?
Players are now more culturally powerful than they ever have been. That mirrors celebrities, it mirrors athletes in other sports. The reality is that the decisions that footballers now make has an impact on brand value. It has an impact on their clubs. It has an impact on their national teams. It has an impact on governing bodies. So obviously you use Cristiano Ronaldo as an example of when he went to Juventus, but also another example was in the Euros last year when he removed a Coca-Cola bottle from his press conference, right? And
there you go.
Told everyone to kind of drink water. And I think the message there was be more responsible. And I think that's my underlying statement, is that brands, clubs, rights holders now need to be way more responsible with who they select as their commercial partners, because if players don't agree with it within the confines of what they're able to do contractually, they're going to stand up and take a stand. And when they stand up and take a stand because of the platforms that they now have, it's going to echo, right? And the scrutiny of sponsorship is is bigger than ever. We've seen an influx of kind of cryptocurrency partners within sport over the course of the last few years. Hugely volatile world where scrutiny is kind of very, very high. The World Cup going to Qatar and what that means. Again, we've seen what Hummel did with the Danish national football team, which I think is absolutely fascinating and a real kind of watershed moment. We saw the Australian football team come out last week and kind of take a very visible kind of stance as to what their opinion about the World Cup being in Qatar was. So, yeah, we're living in this era where footballers, celebrities have got so much cultural power that ultimately the decision makers now need to be fully aware of that, and they need to kind of do far more due diligence in the kind of brand partners they choose and be far more responsible in the people that they're partnering with. Players will continue to take a stance if their kind of partners or their clubs or the national teams aren't going to be more responsible.
Fundamentally, though, this changes the business model, because before you used to see clubs really they had a massive contribution of the revenues coming from sponsorship. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that this can potentially disrupt that in a way?
I think it's got the potential to get very litigious if they disrupt it during a kind of a contract. I don't necessarily think it will take money off the bottom line. I just think you'll see new partnerships evolve in different ways than what we're traditionally used to. Mm-hmm. I'd like to think that clubs and rights holders will be far more selective in the types of commercial partners that they select. And as I said, I think they need to do far more due diligence than sadly they are clearly currently doing, because we've seen sponsorships announced and then renounced within the space of a couple of months, right? And we've seen certain companies have so-called CEOs that exist in certain jurisdictions that it turns out that they don't actually exist in the first place, right? So the flip side to that is that brands have a responsibility to now make people very visibly aware of the kind of the good that they are doing. We know that a lot of businesses have enormous kind of CSR budgets and have various kind of initiatives around whether it's kind of zero carbon or whether it's aligned to human rights or whatever it might be. So brand budgets will be kind of pushed towards that. So I think if a rights holder or a team or a footballer or an athlete can show that they believe in the same values and can showcase activation opportunities for brands to partner with them to showcase that, I don't necessarily think it will lead to a kind of a negative impact on the bottom line. I just think money and sponsorship money will be placed elsewhere. Where it will certainly impact teams is that if they take decisions that don't align to a brand's values, and they will suddenly start to see a gap in that commercial and sponsorship revenue for sure.
Yeah, and I was thinking about asking you about certain categories where it makes sense for athletes to look for partnerships, but I think in a way you just answered the question, because it really depends on the values and what the player really represents. So there's no general category. I think in a way, these partnerships have to be true to what the athlete wants to represent. So kind of go into those details. I guess what I did want to, do you think that in that sense, is there any player that either you've worked with that you can share details of, obviously, because I understand there might be some non-disclosure agreements, or any player in general who you believe is doing a good job in looking for their partnership deals?
Yeah, I think every footballer is different, right? So you've rightly said that now it's a lot more about purpose and values over profit, but there is also a fine line between if I was using the equivalent in the legal world, the kind of the pro bono charitable elements of what they do. But also, I think opportunities where there is a kind of purpose-driven element, but also that maximizes commercial opportunity, right? And a lot of the athletes that we work with, as an example, are leveraging their profile in a commercial capacity within businesses that are seen to be getting people more active or driving social change. But I think in terms of using, and not that this person is someone that we have worked with, but Juan Mata is a great example, right? So Juan Mata started a movement a number of years ago with common goal that in reality, no footballer should not sign up to who is operating at a certain level, right? And the reality is that that hasn't happened for various reasons. But he really is the perfect example of someone who has always clearly carried himself with real kind of dignity and purpose. Someone is a huge believer in clearly charitable initiatives and charitable causes. And I don't think there is any example better than how athletes and footballers can kind of give back. And 1%, right? It's minuscule in the grand scheme of what these guys earn. To then enable thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people across the world to benefit from something that seems so simple on the face of it, that in reality should be happening far, far more.
That's actually a perfect segue to, I think, the next pillar that we wanted to discuss. I think, as yourself, I'm a big believer in purpose-driven initiatives, especially when it comes to sport.
Yeah.
I think one of the misconceptions, and this is something that we discuss in the podcast in the second episode with Professor Mohammed Yunus. He's a big believer in, or he's really the creator of the social business movement, and he also believes in the power of sport. So I think one of the misconceptions is that these initiatives that drive for social change cannot be profitable, and that's not true. You can create a social business. Okay, you're not going to maximize return on investment. But what is return on investment? No, is it only the economic side, or is it also the social side? So, I just wanted to ask you first, what do you think about that? First of all, and then second, how do you see that evolving? Do you think more and more players are going to be looking into creating a social legacy rather than just economic?
Yeah, I mean, it goes to that point of the so-called activist athlete, right? And I think because it's absolutely possible to have a kind of a very strong purpose and still generate revenue and profit from a business. I mean, going back to the very start, using the athlete-led venture fund example, Serena Williams raised an $111 million venture fund, and the whole premise of that venture fund is to champion founders who are leveling the playing field for women and underrepresented minorities, right? The stats are that around 2% of venture funding goes to Black people and minorities, right? That's a great example of a for-profit business that is generating revenue, that is also generating supremely powerful positive social change, right? And then going back to your point around whether I think more athletes will follow suit, obviously everyone looks to Marcus Rashford in the COVID era as to obviously what he did, and really kind of took note of the way that that all came about and the team of people he had around him. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when he signed with Rock Nation, who, as we know, are a huge sports and entertainment agency, and I think it's a really good example of athletes bringing in a team of trusted confidants and advisors and commercial people is the reality, PR, comms, brand, and everything else. So I think where people are starting to get savvier is that, you touched on it earlier, that sport has the power to influence huge positive change. And I think what's very topical and current at the moment as well is going back to the kind of millennials and Gen Z conversation, is that a lot of those younger people are losing trust in politicians and in governments, and kind of feeling a bit disillusioned. And they look to athletes as their kind of their to use a current term, as their goats, right, and as their influencers. And these athletes, in some respects, carry more influence with these people than politicians do these days. So I think in an age where sport carries such kind of powerful cultural influence, there's a responsibility actually on these athletes to kind of drive purpose kind of driven initiatives and change. But also, I think what's really important is that they genuinely have a desire to leave a legacy and to give back. And I think once the athletes have achieved everything that they want to professionally, or kind of are coming to the end of their career, the narrative changes to legacy, right? The narrative changes to not me, the athlete, but me, the person, me, the business person, me, the champion of social change, me, the person that wants to leave a legacy that goes beyond who I am as an athlete. And athletes have a genuine desire to leave a legacy and to drive, as I said, positive, impactful change. Examples are all around us, and we know what kind of government initiatives look like and kind of company initiatives look like when it comes to these things. And I don't think footballers are going to be hopefully any different, albeit we'll need some drivers of change to kind of stand up and be the kind of at the forefront of this, and I think others will follow suit.
I agree. And you have, as you mentioned, great examples there, and particularly the one that stands out to me personally is Juan Mata's efforts through Common Goal. And in fact, at World Football Summit, we even gave Common Goal a prize or an award in this year World Football Summit Europe, no, because it's such a great initiative, no. Ben, I want to be respectful of your time, and I just have a few more questions. And I guess the first one would be, we've talked about a lot today in terms of leaving a legacy through different fronts. No? So we talked about investment, sponsorship, social impact, Web3. I want to know any either trend that athletes looking into building a legacy of their own they should look out for, and again, I want to, even though we said it at the beginning of the episode, this is not investment advice whatsoever. This is only for entertainment purposes, and I understand, and I hope the audience understands that. Or other than trends, is there an example of a player that you know of that is actually an example that other footballers can follow suit, that's leaving a legacy across all those fronts as a whole? I know it's complicated, but I don't know if there's anyone that stands out.
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot of the kind of the trends and the dynamics of where obviously the industry is heading. I think it's very much a case by case, individual by individual basis, because as I touched on earlier, you'll have Serena Williams as an example, who's championing underrepresented minorities. You've got Kieran Gibbs, who's backing fintechs in Africa, who kind of want to increase financial literacy and the kind of whole, I suppose, financial ecosystem of that continent. I think there will continue to be a number of kind of purpose-driven initiatives that align to underrepresented minorities, social value, some climate change. And you'll see different athletes come out with different, whether it's venture funds, investment companies, charitable initiatives like Common Goal. So I think from a purpose-driven perspective, that's where I kind of see, obviously, the trend heading. I think in terms of, if we're looking at it purely from a commercial lens, again, we touched on a lot of the kind of the new trends today, the metaverse, Web3, with regards to athletes. I think my hope is that actually over the next kind of 3 years, we just continue to see them become a lot more savvy to the vast array of opportunities that are out there, and the benefit and value they can drive to these opportunities. I kind of coined the phrase the golden triangle. If you intersect high growth, highly scalable, purpose-driven businesses with athletes alongside institutional kind of funding, you can create a very, very powerful kind of symbiotic relationship there. And I think all of those three stakeholders are starting to become more savvy to that. So long may it continue.
I love that golden triangle so much. In fact, I think I'm going to have to invite you back to the podcast to talk about that golden triangle and more examples, because I think that's a framework. I really like frameworks, and I think that's a framework that footballers can really follow, and athletes and institutions and the industry in general. No, so you mentioned that you hope more players get involved, and I guess I don't know if you want to share some advice on, or for those who want to start thinking, those athletes that want to start thinking about leaving a legacy. They're starting to realize they can and they should. So I don't know if you have some advice there that you want to share with them briefly, or...
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, it's just very important to kind of ascertain what is truly important to them. And each athlete is different. They come from different backgrounds, different communities. They hold different beliefs. And I think it's then a case of being able to bring a team around you to kind of integrate that purpose into either commercial initiatives or charitable initiatives or whatever it might be, in order for them to leave the legacy that they want. And I think there's a few lessons to kind of take from what's happened in the past. One-offs don't work. So if you're going to hold yourself out to be a champion of positive social change in whatever industry that might be, or whatever kind of, I suppose, cause is close to your heart, you need to be in it for the long run, right? And if you're going to truly drive the change that you want to, whether for profit or not for profit, you need a kind of tangible evidence and data to back up why you're doing what you're doing and the change that you're driving. Because it's all well and good kind of promoting things and coming out on social media saying you're doing it, but unless you can see the tangible kind of impact that you're actually making, it's not gonna last. So I think it's about understanding what's important to them, making them aware of what opportunities are out there in order for them to be able to drive the change that they want, and then building a team of advisors and industry experts in all different areas to enable them to do that. And you put those kind of three things together, and there's kind of something very impactful that's certainly possible. And we've seen numerous examples of it recently and in the past, and will hopefully continue to do so in the future.
Final question, and forgive me if I put you on the spot a little bit, and feel free to answer it. But you mentioned you were a Manchester United fan, correct?
Yes.
So I always like to ask the guests that like football, if you had unlimited budget, and you could sign any player in history, not right now, but in history, who would you try to get for Manchester United?
Wow. Good question.
Could be someone who played for the club, didn't play for the club.
Yeah,
anybody.
Who would I try and sign? Well, I'd have to decide between a player that has played for the club and hasn't, and they both probably hold various similar character traits, both on the pitch and probably off it as well, and they'd be George Best and Diego Maradona. George Best, nice. Because my dad tells me how unbelievable he was as a footballer, especially playing on the pitches that he played on. And I was in a former life a winger myself, so certainly resonates. And I suppose in terms of a player that hasn't played for the club, it would have to be Maradona. I think Maradona, but managed by Sir Alex Ferguson, because I think you have a character there who represents and embodies everything that a Man United fan wants to see in terms of kind of attacking flair, skill, gets players off their seat, scores incredible goals, but also a personality that only someone like Sir Alex Ferguson could probably handle.
Good manage, yeah.
He's handled many of them in the past. So yeah, I think Maradona managed by Sir Alex Ferguson with me as the chief executive or owner of the football club, that'd be pretty nice.
Well, thank you for justifying that Diego Maradona answer, because not everybody justifies it, and I really like your explanation. And I think you're totally right. No. Anyway, Ben, I want to thank you so much for your time. I don't know if you want to send the audience, where can people find out more about either you or JMW, what you guys do? I don't know if you want to send the audience somewhere to check what you do out.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And first, kind of, as I said at the start, thank you for having me. And also thank you very much for your time, and also to the audience for listening. And I hope it was insightful in some way. But if you want to find out more about who we are, what we do, the best place to look, firstly, would be our website, so jmw.co.uk, and you can link down to our sports pages. You can see the profile of some of our team, and then for myself, I have a social media profile both on LinkedIn and also on Twitter, so at Ben Peppi, where you'll find some of my musings and thoughts around what's going on across a number of the areas we touched on today: the sponsorship landscape, the athlete investment landscape, and so on. So please follow, take a read, have a listen of the podcast. And I look forward to hopefully hearing from you in the future. If anyone wants to get in touch, my DMs are open, as is my email, which is ben.peppi@jmw.co.uk, which you'll find on our website anyway.
And I highly recommend the audience to give you a follow, not only because of the things you've said, so you usually say on your social profiles, but also because of what's coming. As we've discussed, I think it's really important to follow experts like yourself to kind of keep up with the trends that are going to shape the future of the industry. So, Ben, thank you so much. This has been great. I'm sure the audience is going to have a great time. I certainly had, and hopefully we'll bring you back to speak about that golden triangle.
I'd love to. Thank you so much. Take care.
And there you have him, Ben Peppi, Head of Sport at JMW Solicitors, with a masterclass on how athletes and footballers can create an outstanding legacy based on 3 pillars: investment, partnerships, and social impact. Key takeaways for me from this wide-ranging conversation: 1, both investment and partnership opportunities that emerge need to be authentic to the athlete. They need to have a certain degree of alignment with their values. 2, athletes need to surround themselves with a capable team that will help them maximize impact, regardless of it being financial or social. 3, the golden triangle framework that Ben explains at the end. Look for high growth, highly scalable, and highly purpose-driven initiatives. Is there anything else that stood out for you? If so, reach out across social media and let us know. And remember, you can subscribe and rate the podcast on the platform of your choice, and that you can share with other colleagues in the industry. Remember, we are a little over 1 month away from our first ever World Football Summit Africa, which is on November 16th and 17th. If you want to be part of the collective that will help shape the African football industry into an instrumental player in the global football scene, make sure you head over to our website and buy your ticket right now. Remember, the website is africa.worldfootballsummit.com. That's africa.worldfootballsummit.com. We really hope to see you in Durban. Nothing else from my side. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the World Football Summit podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.